welcome everybody to our first podcast, the history of video games. And this was conceived primarily as a way of informing my girlfriend of the history of video games because she really knows nothing about it. And we thought there isn't really a kind of accessible podcast out there for people who aren't video games fans but want to understand more about it, if that's fair. So, I mean, computers in the 40s and the 50s, they were basically enormous mainframes that only very wealthy companies could afford. Uh, in fact, the only reason why anyone invested in games at all was for testing purposes.
I was just going to ask because with these early, you said the 40s and 50s, I
Yes.
cannot imagine. I thought that was before wood was invented. So like, I'm just wondering what the purpose of. I mean, they must have been the size of rooms or buildings. So what was the initial purpose? Couldn't have been someone in the 40s saying, "Right, let's make Final Fight." They must
No.
have, they must have done it for some other reason apart from.
Automation, I guess. I mean, if that's why a very wealthy company, they were so expensive that it would be a toss-up, wouldn't it, between like, do I buy a mainframe or do I employ X amount of staff to do this data entry or to do these calculations? So, yeah, I mean, games really came about kind of accidentally at that stage. So they'd be sort of human-machine interaction research or military research. So the earliest games were things like Bertie the Brain, for example, made in 1950, a tic-tac-toe game. And there was one called Hutchspiel in 1955, which was a game designed to simulate a war between Russia and Europe.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Did these, when you say like a Birdie the Brain, was that a two-player game? Was there any artificial intelligence?
No, it wasn't designed to be a game as such. It was really just about researching human-computer interaction. The reason why SpaceWar is considered the first game, because it's the first video game, is because it's the first game to be designed as a game to be played.
Oh, right, okay.
So, which brings us on to SpaceWar, which is regarded as the first true computer game. It was made in 1962, and it basically involved controlling dots or spacecraft around a small circular radar-like screen. Now, we've watched videos of this, and you can see videos of it on YouTube.
But I was just saying that what I found really interesting about that was that there was no sort of software. It was all about pushing the hardware, like the sort of trail, smoke trail, whatever you get in space, the star trail behind the spaceship was just screen burn, and I thought that was really interesting that they actually sort of took the hardware and pushed it as opposed to actually designing a program around it.
Right, so they weren't programming software as such, but just manipulating hardware.
That was the word I was
Right,
looking for.
yeah. Yeah, and also what's interesting is it was of course before artificial intelligence, because that would have required programming, so which meant it needed two players in order to make it an actual challenge or a game. So it's not only the first video game, but also the first multiplayer game as well.
What was the actual purpose of it? I know there was two dots with a sort of trail behind them, but what could they shoot, or did they just avoid each other?
I think it's just avoiding each other. I think that literally was it. It's quite familiar.
It was originally going to be called Virtual Marriage, wasn't
it? It was. It kind of looks like a radar screen, if you can imagine it. I mean, hopefully we can get some pictures alongside this podcast, so that'll make it a lot easier. Because describing the very first video game is a bit of a challenge.
I find it interesting because the guy who was sort of illustrating how it worked was clearly well into his 50s or 60s.
Yeah.
So it's not like some young buck came, hurtling.
No, exactly. No, it was very. It was very much in the research realm, shall we say. So it wasn't until the early 70s that actually the idea came along to produce something for the home market. And the first games console was produced by the TV manufacturer, Magnavox. And they released the Odyssey.
The Odyssey.
The Odyssey.
That's the one where you just put... Is that where you control lights and put on the sort of see-through translucent maps on the screen?
That is it.
What is weird though is with these early consoles, with usually that they're all variations on Pong, different colours or size bats or obstacles, really basic. But got light guns with them, which I found
Mm,
really. It was that such a massive. It seems like
yeah,
such a massive leap. I mean, even if you're just aiming at a screen and shooting at squares floating
yeah.
around, that's such a huge leap.
I guess it perhaps it's down to the fact that controllers hadn't become standardized then. I
Hmm.
mean, no one really knew what to do with video game controllers back then. I mean, most of these really early consoles, such as Magnavox Odyssey and others, used dials for the
Yeah.
controllers, didn't they?
Yeah.
They had these thick brown wires. In fact, everything was distinctly brown. Um, and basically, as you say, most of the games are variations of Pong.
Yeah.
And I suppose we better explain what Pong is.
Yes, this is true actually. Yeah.
So, how would you describe Pong?
I would describe it as a computerized version of table tennis at its
Mm,
most basic.
yeah. So, so on the screen, essentially, you have
Two thick lines.
two
It's
thick
on the
lines.
far left and far right, or top or bottom.
Yeah, and a ball, which is basically a square,
It is a square,
indeed a
yeah.
square, bounces between them, and the idea is for each player to stop it from going off their side of the screen by getting their paddle in the way,
Hmm.
and it just bounces back and
I
forth.
actually don't. I also have got to say as well that there was the scoring system. I think in most of the early consoles, it goes up to 9, and then it just goes back to 0 in character. So
Ah, right.
there's no, you can't beat it. It just
Yeah.
loops onwards and onwards.
Oh, right. Yeah. So there just wasn't the kind of real estate on the screen to be doing that.
Yeah, that's it.
So,
Diddling, you've won. In fact, there wasn't sound effects in the early
no,
ones either.
no, that came later. Um, yeah. So Pong was 1972, and I suppose like it's one of the most influential games ever made because it was something that people could recognize, people could play instantly.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a step up from SpaceWar, where it's two dots floating around, or it's a step up from putting pieces of paper on a screen to make a maze or whatever.
Yeah. And because, of course, with the Magnavox Odyssey, with the paper on the screen, a lot of the games basically evolved around you using the controller to sort of make your way through these mazes. But because
Mm.
it was a paper on the screen, you couldn't. There was nothing stopping you from just going wherever you wanted. So there
Yeah,
was no real, unless you had someone there saying, "Oh, you hit the wall," then you've
yeah.
lost the point.
I mean, it seems quite depressing now, the idea of a boy sitting in his bedroom, like navigating around this maze and like trying not to break the rules, but
But by
realize,
himself.
but by himself, and there's no one there to enforce those rules, particularly not the game itself. So yeah, so that's the early 70s. The Magnavox Odyssey was actually a failure as well. I mean, it wasn't like
Really?
it wasn't big time. I read somewhere it was partly to do with the fact that they, for some reason in their advertising, were trying to um, also advertise their TVs. So it made it sound like if you bought a Magnavox Odyssey, you needed a Magnavox TV, which wasn't the case because all it was is a standard
Oh wow.
connector. But
But if you
that,
talk in the early 70s, TVs would have been pretty expensive then as well.
yeah.
So
So
buying a specific TV they would have made out would have been sort of bespoke. They probably would have ramped the price up on that as well.
most likely, yeah.
Ah.
So, but I mean, it kept things going, and yeah. So I mean, the Magnavox itself, it wasn't very successful. So actually, during the early 1970s, um, a lot of video game development took place in universities, because that's where basically,
The innovation was coming from.
yeah,
With these,
clever young men with
yeah,
access to computers.
yeah, actual computers.
Yes.
Yeah.
And of course, often they were networked as well, meaning they were connected up like a kind of local internet, if you like. Um,
In the early 70s, they must have been 28.8K modem.
yeah, broadband was pretty hard to come by back then, unfortunately. The games the students made were extremely basic and largely text-based, which meant it's meant the rise of the text adventure. Now, Brett, you describe what a text adventure is.
A text adventure is sort of where you sort of, it's a parser, isn't it? They refer to it as. It's like
Yeah.
it's basically what often happens is the early ones again there would have been no sound, so it would just be a block of text, or literally like a page from a book that would really visually describe a room
Mm.
in text format, and then you have you usually type in north, east, west, pick up key. And if you typed in, there would be sort of universal things like if you typed in look, it would describe the room again for you. Or if you said something, if it said there was a key on the floor, you could say look at key or look key.
Mm.
And then it would, you could pick up the key to open the door. And they were very, very basic, especially the early ones. But it also gave it that interactive book feel.
Yeah.
And it also, one of the main challenges actually in that was because the parser only understood certain sort of verbs.
Mhm.
A lot of the game where
Go on.
you'd see a key and you would type in pick up key and it would say I don't understand. Pick up the key that I do not understand. Pick up the golden key, and eventually it would be pick up the slightly tarnished off bronze key, and it would say you've picked up a slightly tarnished off bronze key.
Yeah, because of course it's programmed and like it can
It's
only recognize
strictly, yeah.
what's been programmed. So yeah, I mean, but even back then, I mean, there were experiments in kind of online gaming. There was Multi-User Dungeon made in 1978, which was okay, it's text-based, but it was where users could share adventures in the same space, so they could bump into each other within
Oh,
the
that's
game
cool. I
world.
didn't know that.
Yeah, and then that led to a game called Rogue, which was another adventure, but this time, although it was text-based, um,
Didn't they use sort of like a thief would be a T, or like
exactly.
yeah, I remember
Yeah.
that.
So it'd be kind of top down, the idea, and you'd have like the walls were made of brackets and stuff,
Yeah,
and
nothing wrong with that.
yeah, and you'd have like a sword represented by a forward slash, or yeah, a G would be a goblin, a big G would be I don't know, a giant goblin.
Big Goblin, yeah.
Yeah. So which was kind of cool.
But I think that as well, those sort of because the term roguelike lives
Yes.
to this day. They still make
Yeah.
roguelike games on that basis. But I remember reading that because it was based so much on chance, because when you
Mm.
attacked something, you basically walked into it,
Yes.
and behind the scenes there would be a load of algorithms that worked out what the outcome of that strike would be depending on your
Mm.
armor type and whatever, and it would. I don't know. I just found that really interesting. It was so heavily based on maths and chance.
Yeah. Well, and of course they were generated randomly. They were randomly generated environments. So you'd have these dungeons, which would be okay. It would start off easy and get harder and harder, but that was about it. Otherwise, the layout was kind of random, and it made it kind of
The first games with replay value, really.
yeah, it was kind of infinitely replayable in a way, infinitely impossible as well, of course, because they're designed to kill you by the end. But yeah, so that was happening, and then there was the second generation of games consoles, and this is where things really picked up. Also, this was really in the mid to late 70s. Um, the second generation began with something called the Fairchild Video Entertainment System, VES. It's worth bearing in mind, really, at this point, that in those days, a single programmer would be writing the game code, doing the graphics,
Yes.
doing the sounds, if there was any. Um, and this was also the time when games cartridges were introduced, because in the first generation it tended to be the fact that
Built in.
they were built in
Yeah, it was
into the
usually
system itself.
they would use, like I said, in the early sort of Pong console days in the 70s, there would be a picture of, and it was always stickmen, weirdly, like the
Yeah,
kind of men you get in sports biscuits, and it would be like table tennis,
yeah,
pong, ice hockey, squash, and they would basically be variations of the theme, but it would be a dial
yeah,
that you turned, sort of clunked across, and
right. And that would just literally just
it
alter the
would on the
layout of the
screen just
screen.
flick the layout. Yeah,
Yeah. So, but now along came games cartridges. Now, a games cartridges was the standard in computers from pretty much the mid 70s to the mid 90s, let's say.
yeah. Or in the case of Nintendo 64, the late
They
90s.
just wouldn't let that one lie, would they? So inside the cartridge casing, basically, a specially created circuits containing the elements of the game. If you imagine that the console itself contains, say, 75% of the circuit board, the cartridge or cart contains the other 25%, um, completing the circuit, if you like, and creating the game.
I never thought of it like that. Actually. That's
Yeah,
interesting.
I mean, if you think of the console as the body, but it needs the brain, which is the cartridge to actually do stuff.
Hmm.
So that's how that works. And yeah, and they're varying sizes, the cartridges, and it was a good system because
It was
it,
instant as well.
yeah, it was yeah, because it was essentially just completing the circuit. It was not like a disc where it has to read something. It's completing the circuit. It's instantly on the screen.
And also, I think there was the first time there was true variation in the games as well you could play.
Yeah, of course. And now, of course, it that was the beginning of game collections, because now people wouldn't just buy a console and get their 8 versions of Pong on it.
Slightly different coloured screens.
They would buy a games console and be able to buy games for it. Very few people back then knew how popular and valuable these consoles would be
Mm-hmm.
at this point. But yeah, so this is it. Really, it created the home gaming we know today. At the same time this was happening, there was an explosion in the arcade world. Not literally an explosion, but as in arcades and arcade machines were becoming extremely popular, largely because games companies, most of whom previously produced board games or card games, realized they could monetize video games by making it a kind of social experience.
Because didn't Nintendo originally make card games?
Well, yeah, Nintendo has actually been going since, yeah, the 19th century. They originally made
Oh,
card
really?
games.
Wow.
But yeah, so an arcade machine, which you would have seen around the place,
Mm-hmm.
is basically a large self-standing cabinet containing one or more games. The player pays to play. For example, they'd pay like a quid for 3 lives. Um, yeah, and arcade halls could contain dozens of machines, and it meant people could kind of watch others beat high scores and play competitively and stuff. It was a good time.
It was because I suppose the genius with arcades were it was no longer you were sort of not relegated to just you and a friend or your family having somewhere to go.
Mm,
It meant sort of that achieving a high score in a game or beating a game would be much more sociable
yeah,
than just the fact you're doing it in your bedroom.
yeah, and it was. I mean, they were tough. They were designed to be
They're
tough.
designed for you to have like 2 or 3 minutes on it, and then for the next person to come along. Or
Yeah,
the money making machines.
they were money making machines, but they were really fun, and they were also more powerful than home consoles, which was very appealing to people, because obviously they couldn't get. I mean, around that time it'd be like you'd have home video game quality, and you'd have arcade quality, which was
Yeah.
a massive step up. Because obviously, if you imagine like a small home video console and then a tiny cart, it's like there's not much space there really
Yeah.
for,
Well, if you've
for
got something
power
the
and
size of
circuit boards.
a freestanding fridge,
Yeah.
it's going to be full of more gold.
Yeah. So, yep. So that's where you would have seen some real key games. I mean, Space Invaders,
Hmm
1978. Can you describe Space Invaders, please, Brett?
Space Invaders was sort of it did have color actually. It
Mm.
was green, wasn't it? Green and black. And you have you sort of a ship at the bottom which is quite phallic, and then you have in front of the ship there's a few sort of pixels in front. There's sort of 3 blocks that you can hide behind as your shields, but there's sort of a squadron of enemy aliens that sort of move around the screen in a set pattern
Mm.
and shoot down at you, and they sort of eat away at the shields, and you've basically got to shoot all of the aliens before they reach the bottom of the screen. And what's terrifying
Mm.
about Space Invaders is the music, because it starts off as like a dud, 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 but then as they get closer to you and they speed up, the music speeds up with them. So
Mm.
and they speed up as they do it. So you're frantically trying to shoot the aliens as they do this sort of zigzag pattern on the screen, and it's going dud, 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 dud. Terrifying game. Probably the
Mm.
first survival horror.
Um, there was also around that time Pac-Man,
Mhm.
um, which was the famous maze game and my girlfriend's favourite game so far. Um,
Till she plays Pac-Mania on the Mega Drive.
um, so Pac-Man we're all kind of aware of.
You're going to do the story about where the shape comes from.
No, I don't know what
They were trying to make the first sort of video game mascot, something
Yeah.
released that there wasn't just a spaceship or whatever. And I do not know the name of the Japanese gentleman who came up with it, but they were in the office late one night. Honestly, it had to be a really easy shape, but something that was quite iconic.
Mm.
And they were working in the office late one night, and there was a slice missing out of a pizza that they'd ordered in, and he spotted it and thought, yes.
It's so
And
simple.
yeah,
Yeah.
but also it's the because the mouth, I think, in the early games it does open and close, it does eat. So
Yeah.
I suppose it's basically a circle with a wedge missing.
Well,
Every
it's
frame.
literally 2 frames, and
Yeah.
it's like in a way, I mean, it was kind of gaming's first hero, because I would say this was prior to Donkey Kong, so before we have that conversation. But I guess it was the first recognizable hero, if you like, because games before that tended to have spaceships or bats.
And of course, it had cutscenes as well. It
Yeah,
had really brief cutscenes of Pac-Man being chased by the ghosts,
and then
and a recognizable theme tune as well.
and then of course if you won, then you'd come along and meet Miss Pac-Man, who got her own game. She
Yeah,
just had a bow and a
she was crying out for her own game that girl, and lipstick on.
yeah, definitely. Yeah, an interesting approach to feminine representation in games. Yeah, and then came in 1981 Donkey Kong, starring
Yes,
Jumpman.
Jumpman, and of course, the woman of his dreams, Pauline. Such an enthusiastic name.
Oh god, they haven't really thought it through at that
Because
stage.
she's Pauline. That's okay. They would have just thought of like a European woman's name.
Mm.
Oh, the 70s, 80s, boom, Pauline, and they obviously watched EastEnders. But then Jumpman, they didn't even give him a name.
Yeah, it was bad news, that wasn't it? I mean, obviously, when we're talking about Jumpman and Pauline, um, they became Mario and well, Princess Peach,
Yeah.
I guess. I mean, Donkey Kong was, you will have seen it. It's a platform game. It's the first great platform game, and it's still playable. And
Yeah.
it's still good, even
Still
though for
very.
some reason the loudest sound effect in the game is his footsteps.
Yeah.
Relentless.
It's like a. It's like he's walking in wellies on like a rubber floor.
Yeah,
It's such a constant sound.
it's
as well.
astonishing. So Jumpman eventually became known as Mario, named after
Oh,
the warehouse manager at Nintendo of
really?
America. Yeah, his name was Mario something. He was very popular, so
His name
they
was Mario then.
no, but they wanted something to appeal to the Western audience. So, and he was very popular, so they named it after him.
That's pretty cool.
It is pretty cool, yeah. So I guess in a way, when you look at those kind of games we mentioned just then, that's when the kind of genres started getting really formed.
Yeah, because there was a lot of in the 70s, the first sort of wave of home consoles came in. There was a lot of space games. It was
Yeah.
all very much because I suppose with sci-fi
Yeah,
and being big and an easy representation as well of a shape
yes,
shooting at another shape.
absolutely.
It
Because
was
you mean
so many home
a
consoles.
spaceship can be a triangle. You can't really represent a person as a triangle.
Mm,
Yeah. So I mean, so Space Invaders was like a shoot 'em up. Basic description:
yeah,
shoot them before they shoot you.
yeah,
Donkey Kong was a platform game, which basic description: move a character across platforms to reach a goal.
yeah.
Pac-Man, I suppose, is unique in a way because you can't really.
It's a survival game. It
Yeah,
really is.
it's kind of a maze game, I
Yeah, a
suppose.
maze game is yeah.
Yeah, but it is about survival. I
And it
mean,
was the first game as well with real artificial intelligence because the
oh
ghost in it
yeah,
had a real distinct personality.
yeah, that's a really good point actually because I mean it's actually quite scary and like weirdly
Yeah, and
compelling.
because the eyes move towards you as well as they sort of come, it
Mm,
is quite creepy.
yeah, and it's sort of infinite possibilities really with that, which again makes it still playable. Um, Now, in the early 1980s, the video game industry was worth over $3 billion
Really?
worldwide. It was massive. Yeah. Um, and this is where you got the first kind of console war, and this has become standard now. Like you'll hear
Yeah,
about PlayStation versus Xbox, etc. This is where it really started happening because you had the Atari 2600,
mm.
you had the ColecoVision,
Oh, of course.
and you had the Intellivision, which I don't really know anything about. But basically, I mean, they each had kind of strengths. So, like the Atari 2600 had its Space Invaders. The ColecoVision had its own version of Donkey Kong, and the Intellivision is very powerful at the time, apparently.
I've only ever played ports. I used to have a PS2 game with ports of Intellivision games on it.
Yeah.
An amazing theme tune. But the games were very much stuff like Berserk. I remember being on it.
Mm.
Really early, sort of, and that was another shoot 'em up where actually Berserk on the Intellivision was a proper representation of a stickman with really weirdly smooth leg animation, and it
Mm.
was one of those games where it was viewed sort of top down, but he was sort of lying flat
Mm.
or at a slight isometric
Oh,
angle.
that's
It was
weird.
quite weird. But yeah, you were just walking around shooting aliens walking towards you. So essentially, it was asteroids.
Right. Yeah. Asteroids, for the uninitiated, being a game in which a tough game. Again, this was an early game around the Space Invaders era, I guess,
Yeah.
which involved you as a spaceship in the middle of the screen.
A triangle.
A triangle, yes. And basically there were asteroids flying around the place, and when you shot them,
They got incrementally smaller.
yeah, so it made it absolutely crazy. So you got all these asteroids flying around, getting smaller and smaller, breaking into smaller and smaller pieces, each of which can destroy you instantly.
No energy, thank God.
Yeah, and
And if you went off the screen, you just sort of looped.
yeah, this was the interesting thing about the controls in it were
Really advanced, because you had inertia as well.
yeah, absolutely. It was all to do with inertia. I mean, you basically boosted along in one direction, and it was, well, like space, because you boosted in one direction, you just kept going in that direction. So what you'd have to do is turn your ship and boost in the other direction to slow yourself down and go the other way. So it was a lot of inertia. It was a kind of realistic space.
You went to a wedding the
simulation.
other day and you were inertia, weren't you?
No.
And Usher.
Ah, I thought you were going to say in a shirt for a second. I thought, will you go there?
Please
So
don't.
that was yeah, asteroids. So that was when yeah, it was worth a lot, the video games industry
$3
back then.
billion. Was that
Three
dollars? as
$3
well?
billion, over $3 billion, which is a lot. I mean, it's not as much as today, but considering, when that was, and considering
What would that have been with inflation now?
who knows, it could
I
be.
don't know. I'm just wondering if it would be worth more now
Yes.
or than.
I don't think it would be necessarily.
But
I mean,
for a
now
fledgling industry.
for its fledgling industry, it was extremely impressive.
Mm.
But now the gaming industry is worth more than music and film combined,
Really?
because it's absolutely vast. So it's here to stay, but it wasn't always here to stay, because actually, in 1983, something happened.
It was a faux pas.
Yeah, there was a bit of a wobble in the space-time continuum, and gaming almost fell apart completely and crashed essentially. So in the next episode, we'll start from 1983 and the so-called Atari shock.
And the year of my birth as well.
Oh yeah.